The river only screams when it's taking something down with it. Nia was huddled beneath the rusted iron span of the Han River Bridge at exactly 3:14 a.m., just as the first freezing rain began to turn into sleet. She knew this spot, the concrete pillar with the jagged crack, like the back of her scarred hand. It was the only place in Seoul where the wind didn't bite quite as hard, and the police rarely bothered to look. But tonight, the wind was silenced by the screech of high-performance tires and the thunderous snap of a guardrail half a mile above her head. The luxury sedan didn't just fall, it plummeted like a black stone. The impact with the water was a hollow, bone-shaking boom that echoed through the riverbank like a detonated bomb. Nia stood mid-step, her thin, threadbare coat fluttering as she strained to see through the mist. Silence followed. A heavy, suffocating silence that felt more dangerous than the crash itself. She started walking away, her worn boots slipping on the mud. She couldn't afford to be seen. She couldn't afford a single conversation with anyone in a uniform. Her secret, the phone tucked into a plastic bag inside her pocket, was a ticking time bomb, and her bank account was even worse. 12 for 101. That was it. Not enough for a bus ticket out of the city, barely enough for 2 bowls of cheap ramyun. If she got caught now, if she became a witness to whatever violence had just occurred on that bridge, she wouldn't just be homeless, she'd be a memory. Nia picked up her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. Asterisk, don't look back. Don't be a witness. Don't make yourself a target. Asterisk, she had learned that lesson at 19, watching the Gyeongsang district burn while men in suits stood by and smiled. Getting involved was a luxury for people who had a home to go back to. Then, she heard it. A muffled, rhythmic thudding. Someone was alive inside that sinking tomb. A man's fist was slamming against reinforced glass, the sound growing weaker and more desperate with every passing second. It wasn't a scream, but it was a plea. Nia stopped. Every instinct told her to run until her lungs burned. But as she looked at the dark water, she saw a single hand pressed against the glass of the sinking car, illuminated by the dying glow of a dashboard light. On the wrist was a flash of gold, and on the neck, a glimpse of dark, jagged ink, the mark of a monster. She knew who he was. Everyone in the underground knew the silhouette of Choi Hyun-woo. Freeing him would be the most dangerous thing she'd ever do, but leaving him would be the end of her last shred of humanity. The sun had not yet burned through the thick Seoul fog when the mechanical precision of the Choi estate began its daily grind. For Choi Hyun-woo, the morning was not a time of rest, but a meticulous reconstruction of the mask the city feared. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his dressing room, his body a map of scars and stories that the world was never meant to read. His ritual was performed in a silence so absolute it felt heavy, a pressure that seemed to hum in the very walls of the mansion. He began with the shirt, bespoke, silk blend, and white enough to be blinding. As he pulled it over his broad shoulders, the mirror caught the sharp, obsidian lines of the vertical tattoo running down the left side of his neck. It was a jagged warning, a permanent mark of the violence he had mastered. To his rivals, it was a death warrant. To the woman who had pulled him from the river, it was a reminder of the monster she had unleashed. He buttoned his cuffs with a series of metallic clicks that sounded like a weapon being readied, then donned a charcoal gray suit jacket that fit him like armor. When Choi Hyun-woo stepped out of his room, the atmosphere of the house shifted. The air didn't just move, it curdled. 2 guards, standing like granite statues at the end of the hall, snapped their chins down in a synchronized bow. They did not speak. In Hyun-woo's world, noise was a sign of a mind out of control, and he demanded a stillness that bordered on the religious. He radiated a casual menace, the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. He descended the grand staircase, his leather shoes striking the marble with a rhythmic, predatory cadence. As he reached the dining hall, he saw her. Nia was a shadow moving within shadows. Dressed in the muted, dark tones of the domestic staff, she moved with the quiet desperation of someone trying to fold herself into the wallpaper. She was busy setting the table for his breakfast, her movements fluid and frantic in their attempt to be invisible. Her natural hair was pulled back into a severe, tight bun, and her gaze was fixed resolutely on the white linen of the tablecloth. She was the only person in the estate who didn't bow, not out of defiance, but because she seemed to be holding her breath, hoping that if she didn't move, he wouldn't see the girl who had touched his skin when he was at his most vulnerable. Hyun-woo paused at the head of the table, his dark eyes tracking the line of her shoulders. She was a ghost he had invited into his fortress, a life debt he had repaid by giving her a roof and a dark uniform. Yet, she filled his silent house with a haunted energy that he couldn't categorize. She didn't smell of the expensive floor wax or the sterile air conditioning. She smelled of rain, cold earth, and the lingering, metallic scent of a city that had tried to crush her. He sat, and the sound of the chair scraping against the marble made Nia's fingers twitch. She reached for the porcelain coffee pot, her hand steady but her knuckles white. As she leaned in to pour, a single drop of coffee splashed onto the saucer. The sound was microscopic, but in the pressurized silence of the room, it felt like a landslide. Hyun-woo didn't look at the cup. He looked at the side of her face. He saw the way her pulse hammered against the thin skin of her throat. She was terrified, but it wasn't the fear of a subordinate. It was the fear of a creature that had been hunted for so long it forgot what it was like to be safe. He adjusted his cuff, the movement sharp and disciplined, and for a moment, the casual menace he projected felt like a physical weight between them. He took a sip of the coffee, the heat doing nothing to melt the ice in his veins. He didn't speak a word of thanks, and she didn't offer a word of greeting. They were two survivors trapped in a beautiful, silent cage, one owning the air and the other merely breathing it. As Nia turned to vanish back into the kitchen, Hyun-woo's eyes lingered on the doorway. He was the head of a syndicate that ruled through fear, but as he watched the invisible girl disappear, he realized he wasn't interested in her obedience. He was interested in why she was still running, even inside a fortress. Nia's world had shrunk to the width of a silver polishing cloth and the terrifying weight of the plastic-wrapped lump hidden in the waistband of her uniform. In the sprawling, silent expanse of the Choi estate, invisibility was her only currency. She moved through the corridors like a flicker of candlelight, always keeping her back to the walls, her eyes mapping the exits while her hands performed the mindless labor of the elite. She scrubbed, she buffed, and she served, all while playing the part of a girl who had no name and no past. But the past was a physical weight. Every time she moved, she felt the hard edges of the burner phone pressing against her hip, the Gyeryong secret. On that tiny, cracked screen was the only evidence of the night the sky turned orange and the screams of her neighbors were drowned out by the roar of state-sanctioned engines. It was her death warrant and her only shield, and carrying it inside the home of a mafia boss felt like holding a lit match in a room full of gunpowder. The kitchen was her sanctuary and her cage. It was a place of stainless steel and sharp knives, a sterile environment where the head chef and the other staff treated her like a piece of furniture that occasionally moved. Nia preferred it that way. In the streets, being noticed meant being prey. Here, being noticed meant meeting the gaze of Choi Hyun-woo. She feared him with a cold, vibrating intensity that made her breath hitch whenever a door opened. She had seen him at his weakest, choking on river water, his life leaking out of a gash on his temple, and that made him more dangerous than any of the men hunting her. He was a man who lived by the debt of blood, and she had placed him in the highest debt imaginable. Every time he looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, she wondered if he was looking for a way to repay her or a way to erase the witness of his vulnerability. He was a monster, she knew that. She saw it in the way the guards flinched when he walked past. She saw it in the jagged tattoo that crawled up his neck like a shadow trying to swallow his head. He was the very embodiment of the violence she had spent her life fleeing. Yet he was the only thing standing between her and the untouchables who worked for Councilman O. As she prepared the evening tea tray, her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of the kettle. She looked different in the uniform, tamer, diminished, but her eyes still held the hollowed-out stare of the girl who had slept under the Han River Bridge. She hated the silence of the house. It was a pressurized, artificial quiet that made her feel like she was underwater again. The weight of the phone shifted, a reminder of the footage she had captured, the councilman's men lighting the matches, the exchange of envelopes, the calculated destruction of a community. She knew that if Hyunwoo found it, he wouldn't go to the police. He would use it as leverage. He would turn her tragedy into a transaction. To him, the world was a chessboard. To her, it was a graveyard. She jumped as the service bell rang, a sharp, crystalline sound that felt like a needle to her nerves. It was a summons to the library. His library. Nia gripped the handles of the tray until her knuckles ached. She practiced the flinchless mask she had perfected on the streets, smoothing her apron and lowering her gaze. She had to stay below the eye line. She had to be the ghost in the kitchen, the girl who saved a life and asked for nothing in return. Because if Choi Hyunwoo ever looked closely enough to see what she was really hiding, the sanctuary of his estate would become just another place for her to die. Stepping out of the kitchen, she entered the long, shadowed hallway. The air grew colder as she approached his study, the casual menace of his presence leaking through the heavy oak doors. She was caught between two fires, the one she had fled in Gyeongsang and the one sitting behind a desk 10 feet away. And Nia knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that eventually, one of them was going to burn her alive. The library was a chamber of heavy mahogany and the scent of expensive tobacco, a room designed to make men feel small. Choi Hyunwoo sat behind his desk, the dim light of a single lamp catching the sharp edge of his jaw and the jagged ink of the tattoo on his neck. He didn't look up when Nia entered. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he had used on countless men to watch them unravel, to see their sweat bead and their resolve crumble. Nia stood at the center of the Persian rug, the tea tray in her hands. She didn't tremble. She didn't offer a polite cough. She simply stood there, a dark shadow in a dark room, her eyes fixed on the empty space 3 inches above his desk. To Hyunwoo, her stillness was an anomaly. It wasn't the disciplined silence of a soldier. It was the heavy, airless quiet of a tomb. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a physical blow. Nia moved with a robotic grace, setting the tray down and taking the chair opposite him. She sat on the very edge, her spine a straight line of tension, yet her face remained an unreadable mask of exhaustion. Hyunwoo leaned forward, the light finally illuminating his eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and participated in it. "I don't like mysteries under my roof, Nia. You saved my life, and I paid that debt with a job and a ceiling. But you move through this house like you're waiting for the floor to fall out. You don't look at the guards. You don't look at me. You look through everything." Nia didn't blink. "I'm here to work, Mr. Choi, not to look." "Liar," he said, the word sharp and cold. He stood up, pacing the perimeter of the desk like a predator circling a cornered animal. He used his height to shadow her, his casual menace radiating in waves. "I checked the bridge. I checked the logs. A girl like you doesn't just happen to be under a bridge at 3 in the morning unless she's running. And she doesn't dive into freezing water for a man with my mark unless she's desperate for a powerful friend who is looking for you." He expected a flinch. He expected her to crack and beg for his protection, to trade her secret for his muscle. That was the currency of his world. But Nia finally turned her gaze toward him, and for the first time, Hyunwoo saw the true depth of the girl he had taken in. Her eyes were weary, hollowed out by a trauma so profound it had burned away the instinct for self-preservation. There was no fear in them, at least, not for him. "You think you can threaten me with what you are, Mr. Choi? You think your guns and your names are the scariest things I've seen?" She let out a short, dry breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "The men I'm running from don't just kill people. They erase them. They burn down everything they've ever touched and call it progress." Hyunwoo paused, his hand hovering near the collar of his suit. He had interrogated rival bosses who wept for their lives, but Nia looked at him with a frightening clarity. He realized then that he was using a language she no longer spoke. To him, death was the ultimate leverage, the final threat to keep the world in order. But to Nia, death looked like a mercy she hadn't yet been granted. It wasn't a threat. It was an escape she was too tired to chase. "I have nothing left for you to take," she whispered, her voice steady despite the rasp of her breath. You can throw me out. You can give me to them. But don't expect me to be afraid of a monster when I've already lived through the fire. The silence returned, but the power dynamic had shifted. Hyun-woo felt a sudden, sharp jolt of frustration, a crack in his meticulously maintained armor. He was a master of leverage, yet he stood before a woman who had stripped herself of everything that could be used against her. He looked at her small, scarred hands gripped tightly in her lap, and felt an unfamiliar pressure in his chest, a localized storm of curiosity and something that felt dangerously like respect. "Go back to the kitchen," he said, his voice softer now, almost a growl. She stood, bowed slightly, and vanished into the shadows of the hallway without a backward glance. Hyun-woo remained in the dim light, the vertical tattoo on his neck itching under his skin. He had intended to break her secret, but instead, he had found the one thing he couldn't control, a soul that had already survived the end of the world. The heavy, humid air of a Seoul afternoon pressed against the windows of the estate, thick with the scent of an approaching storm. Inside the drawing room, the atmosphere was even more stifling. Choi Hyun-woo sat in a leather armchair, his posture one of rigid, icy elegance as he hosted Councilman Oh. The councilman was a man of manufactured smiles and expensive silk ties, the kind of politician who used the word progress to camouflage the sound of bones breaking. He had come under the guise of discussing port security, but his eyes were restless, darting around the room as if searching for a ghost. Nia entered the room with the quiet, practiced grace of a shadow. She carried a heavy silver tray, the porcelain tea set rattling with a soft, rhythmic chime that filled the gaps in the men's conversation. She kept her head down, her focus narrowed to the task of not spilling a single drop of the dark, steaming liquid. She had become an expert at being a non-entity, a piece of the furniture that breathed. "You have a very disciplined staff, Hyun-woo," Councilman Oh remarked, his voice oily and thin. "It's hard to find such invisibility these days." Nia reached the low table between them. As she leaned over to set the first cup, she made the mistake of glancing up. The world shattered before the porcelain did. Councilman Oh's eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, time became a viscous, suffocating sludge. The recognition was a physical blow. This was the man from the footage. This was the man who had stood on the edge of the Gyeongsang district, his face illuminated by the orange glow of burning homes, nodding his approval as the screams were silenced. The silver tray tilted. The sound of the porcelain hitting the marble floor was as loud as a gunshot in the pressurized silence of the room. Shards of delicate white bone china skittered across the floor, and hot tea splashed across Nia's shoes, but she didn't feel the heat. Her breath hitched, then stopped entirely. Her lungs felt as though they were filling with the very ash of the district she had fled. Her hands flew to her throat, her fingers clawing at the collar of her uniform as the walls of the room seemed to pulse and shrink. It was a total systemic collapse. The library was gone, replaced by the choking smoke of the fire. Hyun-woo was on his feet instantly. He didn't look at the mess. He looked at Nia. He saw the way her pupils dilated until her eyes were nothing but black voids of terror. He saw the way her skin turned a sickly, ashen gray. But more importantly, he looked at Councilman Oh. The councilman hadn't moved to help. He had leaned forward, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his face a mask of predatory shock. The mask of the polite politician had slipped, revealing a jagged, hungry intent. Oh wasn't looking at a clumsy maid. He was looking at a loose end. His gaze followed Nia with a cold, terrifying intensity that made the hair on the back of Hyun-woo's neck stand up. "I apologize, Councilman," Hyun-woo said, his voice dropping into a register that was more growl than speech. He stepped into Oh's line of sight, his tall, broad-shouldered frame acting as a human shield for the trembling girl. "My staff has been working long hours. Nia, go to the kitchen. Now." Nia didn't wait. She scrambled to her feet, her boots slipping on the wet marble, and fled the room with a jagged, sobbing breath. Hyun-woo turned back to the councilman, his casual menace sharpening into a lethal, focused edge. The puzzle pieces he had been trying to force together since the riverbank finally snapped into place. Nia wasn't just a runaway. She was the missing witness the city's elite had been hunting for months. The vertical tattoo on his neck throbbed with the rhythm of his mounting fury. "She seems familiar," O whispered, his eyes still fixed on the doorway where Nia had vanished. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and calculating. "Perhaps she used to work in one of the redevelopment zones?" "She works for me now," Hyunwoo replied, leaning over the desk until he was inches from the councilman's face. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "And in this house, councilman, what is mine is untouchable. I suggest you remember that before you look at my staff again." In that moment, the dead of the river was no longer a matter of honor. It was a declaration of war. Hyunwoo realized that the secret Nia carried was a death warrant, and by keeping her here, he had just invited the executioner to his front door. The heavy oak door of the private surveillance suite sealed with a hiss, the magnetic locks engaging to create a vacuum of absolute privacy. Choi Hyunwoo sat in the blue-tinted darkness, the glow of 6 monitors reflecting in his eyes like cold, digital fire. He did not call for his head of security. He did not summon the hackers on his payroll. In a world built on shifted loyalties, the secret he was about to dig for was too radioactive to share. If the city's elite were hunting Nia, then every hand he paid was a potential knife in her back. He went dark, activating a proprietary encrypted terminal that bypassed the syndicate's standard servers. His fingers, calloused from years of holding both pins and triggers, moved with a lethal, rhythmic efficiency across the keys. He wasn't just looking for Nia, he was looking for the shadow she cast. He breached the firewalls of the Gyeryong redevelopment project, slicing through layers of military-grade encryption that would have taken a team of specialists weeks to penetrate. The screen began to bleed data, memos, wire transfers, and maps of a district that had been wiped off the map. He tracked the digital footprints of Councilman O's private security detail, cross-referencing their location pings with the night of the accidental gas leak. And then he found it. Buried deep within a hidden partition of a discarded cloud server was a single, raw video file. Hyunwoo hit play. The footage was shaky, filmed from the low, claustrophobic perspective of someone hiding in a crawlspace. The audio was a cacophony of roaring flames and the mechanical hum of heavy machinery. But it was the clarity of the crimes that made Hyunwoo's blood turn to ice. He saw the untouchables, men he recognized from the councilman's inner circle, systematically barricading the doors of occupied tenements. He saw the matches lit with casual indifference. He saw Councilman O himself standing in the periphery, checking his watch as if he were timing a bus rather than a massacre. Then, the camera panned for a split second, catching a reflection in a shard of glass. It was Nia's face. Her eyes were wide, flooded with a grief so profound it seemed to transcend the screen. She wasn't just a witness. She was the living record of the city's sins. She was the conscience of Seoul, carrying the weight of 100 murdered neighbors in a phone hidden beneath her uniform. Hyunwoo leaned back, the blue light catching the vertical tattoo on his neck. He had spent his life believing he was the apex predator, the man who understood the true cost of power. But this was different. This wasn't the tactical violence of the syndicate. This was the soulless eradication of the weak for a line on a balance sheet. He watched Nia's face on the frozen frame. He realized then that the flinch he had seen in the drawing room wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a miracle of survival. She had looked into the heart of a son built on human suffering and hadn't gone blind. To the councilman, she was a loose end to be snipped. To Hyunwoo, she had suddenly become the only thing in his cold, gray world that was actually real. The casual menace he usually projected deepened into a cold, predatory resolve. He didn't just need to protect her now. He needed to dismantle the world that had dared to break her. He began to map out the councilman's empire, not for a takeover, but for a demolition. As he watched the flames on the screen, Choi Hyunwoo realized that Nia hadn't just saved his life in the river. She had given him a reason to use his darkness for something other than gold. He reached for a secure line, his voice a low, vibrating growl in the empty room. "This is Choi. Clear the schedule for tomorrow. We're going to war, and this time, We aren't fighting for territory. The blue glow of the surveillance monitors reflected in Choi Hyun-woo's eyes, making them look like polished obsidian. He sat in the air-conditioned chill of the tactical suite, his gaze fixed on the screen showing the estate's kitchen. Nia was there, a small, solitary figure sitting at the stainless steel prep table. She wasn't working. She was simply staring into a cup of untouched tea, her shoulders hunched as if she were bracing for a blow that had been coming for months. Usually, watching someone through a lens gave Hyun-woo a sense of absolute control. Information was power, and observation was the first step to subjugation. But as he watched Nia's chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven breaths, he felt a sensation he couldn't name, a sharp, serrated terror clawing at his chest. It wasn't the fear of an assassin's blade or a police raid. It was the terrifying realization that he was becoming the very thing he wanted to protect her from. He looked down at his hands. They were steady and impeccably clean, but he could feel the phantom weight of the blood they had spilled to build the walls of this fortress. He was preparing a war. He was mapping out deaths and calculating the most efficient way to dismantle Councilman Oh's life. He called it justice, but as he watched Nia flinch at the sudden, mechanical hum of the industrial refrigerator, he realized she would likely call it a nightmare. Nia hated the violence of the city. She had fled the fires of Gyeonggi not just because they were hot, but because they were the physical manifestation of men like him, men who believed that enough force could solve any problem. If he went out tonight and turned the city into a slaughterhouse to save her, would he be any different from the men she was running from? He would just be a different flavor of monster, a predator who claimed ownership of her safety through a fresh trail of bodies. The casual menace he had cultivated his entire life felt like a leaden shroud. He wanted to go to her, to offer some word of comfort, but he knew the moment he stepped into the light, his shadow would swallow her. He saw the way she looked at his men, the silent, armed sentries who patrolled the grounds. To her, they weren't guardians. They were the same wolves that lived in the Gyeonggi district, just wearing better suits and carrying more expensive steel. He stood up and began to pace the narrow confines of the suite, his leather shoes clicking with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that mirrored the beating of a heart he usually ignored. He thought of the vertical tattoo on his neck. It was a mark of survival, a testament to the fact that he was the apex of his world. But in the presence of Nia's quiet, bruised resilience, the ink felt like a brand of shame. He was a creature of the dark, and she was a girl who had seen enough darkness to last 10 lifetimes. What if his protection was just another cage? If he killed for her, he would forever bind her to his world of blood. He would be the reason she could never truly wash the scent of ozone and iron from her skin. The terror in his chest tightened, a suffocating grip that made him loosen his tie. He was a man who lived by the sword, and for the first time, he understood that the sword didn't just cut the enemy. It cut the hand that held it, and everyone standing too close to the blade. He stopped in front of the monitor. Nia had finally moved. She was standing by the window, looking out at the rain-streaked darkness of the estate. She looked so small, so remarkably frail against the backdrop of his reinforced walls. Hyun-woo realized then that he was trapped in a paradox of his own making. To save her from the wolves, he had to be the biggest wolf in the forest. But by being that wolf, he was ensuring she would never truly know peace. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the screen, his breath fogging the image of her face. He had spent his life building a throne of bone and steel, only to realize that the person he wanted to share his world with was terrified of the material. He had to make a choice. He had to decide if he was willing to risk her soul to save her life. And as the thunder rolled over the estate, Choi Hyun-woo felt the crushing weight of a conscience he had thought he'd traded for power. The storm didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It arrived with the rhythmic, muffled shattering of the estate's perimeter sensors. In the surveillance suite, the screens flickered from the serene grays of the rainy grounds to the sharp, thermal signatures of a hit squad moving with the surgical precision of state-sponsored killers. These weren't street thugs or rival mobsters. These were the Untouchables, a shadow team funded by the city's elite, sent to sanitize the one variable they couldn't buy. Nia. Hyunwoo was moving before the first window imploded. He didn't reach for his ledger or his phone to call for reinforcements. His hand went straight for the heavy, matte black handgun concealed beneath the mahogany of his desk. As the estate's secondary alarms began to wail, a low, guttural pulse that vibrated through the floorboards, the casual menace he had cultivated for years evaporated, replaced by a cold, singular focus. He reached the kitchen just as the back entrance was breached. The sound was a deafening roar of splintering wood and flashbangs. Through the acrid smoke, he saw Nia. She was huddled under the prep table, her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with the familiar, soul-crushing terror of Gyeryong. For her, the world was ending again. Nia, look at me. Hyunwoo's voice cut through the chaos, a grounding frequency in the middle of the war. He grabbed her by the arm, not with the bruising grip of a captor, but with the desperate strength of a man anchoring a ship in a hurricane. He hauled her up, shielding her body with his own as the first rounds of suppressed fire chewed through the stainless steel appliances, sending sparks and shrapnel flying like lethal confetti. He dragged her toward the servants' corridor, a narrow passage that led to the estate's panic room. Behind them, his sanctum was being torn apart. This was a territory war, unlike any the city had ever seen. Usually, such battles were fought over docks, drug routes, or political favors. Today, the territory was a 6x6 reinforced room and the life of a girl who had once slept under a bridge. Muzzle flashes strobed against the vintage wallpaper of the hallway, lighting up the vertical tattoo on Hyunwoo's neck like a jagged scar. He fired back with clinical, lethal efficiency, his movements a blur of practiced violence. He had abandoned his tactical distance. Every shot he took was a calculated move to buy her one more second of breath. He wasn't fighting for his reputation or his empire. He was fighting against the reality that he might be too late to save the only person who had looked at him like a man instead of a monster. Get inside. Don't open it for anyone but me, he commanded, shoving Nia into the small, steel-lined vault hidden behind a false pantry wall. Nia grabbed his sleeve, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit. Her face was a mask of raw, unadulterated fear, but for the first time, she wasn't looking past him. She was looking at him, seeing the man behind the menace. Don't become them, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of boots pounding on the marble floors nearby. Hyunwoo didn't answer. He couldn't. He closed the heavy door, the metallic thud of the locks engaging sounding like a final prayer. He turned back to the hallway, alone. The hit squad was closing in, moving in a tight diamond formation. They were professional, well-funded, and legally protected. They represented the untouchable power of the city's elite. But as Hyunwoo stood his ground in the center of the narrow corridor, his shadow stretching long against the bullet-riddled walls, he realized he didn't care about their laws or their power. He was the monster that lived in the dark, and they had made the fatal mistake of bringing fire into his house. He checked his magazine, the click of the metal satisfyingly cold. He wasn't a businessman anymore. He wasn't a boss. He was a guardian who had found his purpose in the debris of his own sanctuary. As the first grenade bounced across the hardwood toward him, Choi Hyunwoo smiled. A grim, terrifying expression that promised the city a night it would never forget. The silence that followed the slaughter was more oppressive than the gunfire. Smoke hung in the air like a heavy, gray shroud, curling around the shattered remains of the estate's grand foyer. The untouchables lay where they had fallen. Expensive tactical gear, now nothing more than shrouds for men who had underestimated the depth of a monster's fury. Hyunwoo stood at the center of the devastation, his charcoal jacket discarded, his white shirt soaked through with sweat and the copper tang of blood. His chest heaved as he stared at the reinforced door of the panic room. He was alive, but the sanctuary of his anonymity was dead. "Boss, we have to move." His lead advisor, a man named Park who had served the syndicate for 20 years, stepped over a body with a look of clinical distaste. Park was a man of shadows and ledgers. He dealt in the quiet solutions that kept the empire invisible. Behind him, A cleanup crew waited in the shadows with industrial plastic and bleach, ready to make the night's sins vanish as if they were nothing more than a spilled drink. We scrubbed the floors, we dumped the bodies in the harbor, and we returned the girl to the streets, Park whispered, his voice urgent and low. If we keep her here, we are at war with the Blue House. If we bury this now, we can tell Councilman O that the hit was successful and she's gone. The syndicate survives. You stay untouchable. It's the only logical path. Hyun-woo didn't look at him. He was watching his own hands. They were steady now, but he could feel the phantom weight of the river water and the way Nia's small, scarred hands had pulled him toward the light. For years, he had lived by the rule of the quiet cleanup, believing that as long as the city didn't see the blood, he was in control. But he looked at the bullet holes in his walls and the shattered porcelain from the day before, and he realized that burying the truth was just another way of letting the councilman win. If he returned Nia to the streets, he was sentencing her to a slow death in the shadows. He would be the coward who used a homeless girl as a shield for his own reputation. No, Hyun-woo said. The word was small, but it carried the weight of a tectonic shift. Sir, Park's eyes widened. To admit to this, to protect her publicly, it's suicide. The rivals will see it as a weakness. The feds will see it as an opening. You'll be trading your empire for a ghost. I'm not trading it, Hyun-woo replied, finally turning to face his advisor. The casual menace had transformed into something far more terrifying, a moral absolute. I'm using it. He walked to the panic room and punched in the code. The heavy steel door groaned open, revealing Nia. She was huddled in the corner, her eyes darting to his blood-stained shirt. She looked for the monster, but she found a man who was done hiding. Hyun-woo, she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. Get your things, Nia, he said, reaching out a hand. He didn't wait for her to take it. He simply held it there, an open invitation to a life lived out loud. We aren't hiding anymore. I'm going to show this city exactly what happens when they try to burn down a home. He turned back to Park, who looked as though he were watching a god fall from the sky. Call the press, Hyun-woo commanded. All of them. Tell them I have a statement regarding the Gyeongsang district fire. And tell the police to stay back. I'm coming out, and I'm bringing the truth with me. You're choosing the fire, boss, Park said, his voice trembling. No, Hyun-woo said, his fingers brushing the vertical tattoo on his neck, the mark of a survivor who was tired of the dark. I'm choosing the light. Let the city see the blood. Let them see her. And let them realize that they should have left the girl under the bridge. He led Nia toward the shattered front doors, stepping over the debris of his old life. He was choosing the messy path, the public path, the path of absolute retribution. He was about to break every rule of the syndicate to save a girl who had nothing, and as he stepped into the rain-slicked night, he knew there was no turning back. The morning air was a bitter, crystalline cold that seemed to freeze the very breath in the lungs of the hundreds gathered outside the estate gates. The perimeter was a chaotic sea of flashing blue and red lights, a wall of camera lenses, and the low, anxious hum of a city on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Every major news outlet in the country was live, their reporters speaking in hushed, frantic tones about the unprecedented breach at the Choi stronghold. They expected a body bag, or perhaps a silent, high-speed getaway from a man fleeing his own carnage. Instead, the heavy iron gates groaned open with a slow, deliberate finality. Choi Hyun-woo stepped out into the blinding glare of the spotlights. He was a vision of ruined elegance. His white shirt was open at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms flecked with the dust of the siege, and the vertical tattoo on his neck stood out like a black flame against his pale skin. He didn't look like a man under arrest. He looked like a king walking through the ruins of a conquered city. And he wasn't alone. Beside him, her hand resting firmly in the crook of his arm, was Nia. She was wrapped in his charcoal gray suit jacket, the heavy wool shielding her from the wind and the prying eyes of the world. She didn't look at the floor this time. Her head was held high, her gaze steady, a survivor standing next to her storm. The swarm of reporters surged forward, a cacophony of shouting voices demanding answers, But Hyun-woo didn't stop until he reached the center of the media line. The casual menace that had defined him for decades had solidified into something far more dangerous, a public vow. He raised a single hand, and the silence that followed was so absolute it felt as though the city itself had stopped breathing. The men who entered my house tonight did not come for my money or my territory. Hyun-woo's voice rumbled, a low, resonant sound that carried to the back of the crowd. They came to silence a witness. They came to bury the truth of the Gyeongsang district fires, a truth that Councilman Oh and his associates thought they could incinerate along with the lives of the innocent. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. He was doing the unthinkable. He was naming names, tearing down the veil of the city's elite in a single, surgical strike. He reached into his pocket and held up a small, cracked burner phone, its screen glowing with the frozen image of the Gyeongsang massacre. "This is Nia," he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, protective register. He looked down at her for a brief second, a flicker of something raw and human passing through his dark eyes. "She is the girl you ignored. She is the witness you tried to erase. And as of this moment, she is the one secret this city will never be allowed to forget. I have already uploaded the contents of this phone to every major server in this country. The fire you started in Gyeongsang is finally coming for you." He stepped closer to the primary camera, his face filling the screens of millions of homes. "Let this be my only statement. Nia is under my absolute protection. She is the guest of the Choi Syndicate, and she carries the weight of my word. If anyone, from the highest office in the Blue House to the lowest gutter in the slums, looks at her with anything but respect, they will answer to me. I have spent my life as a ghost in the shadows. Today, I step into the light to tell you that the giant is awake." He didn't wait for the questions. He didn't stay for the fallout. He turned, shielding Nia with his body, and led her toward the waiting armored sedan. The police officers, men who had spent their careers trying to find a way to break him, stood paralyzed. They watched the monster act as a guardian, realizing that by protecting a homeless girl with a secret, Choi Hyun-woo had become more powerful than he had ever been as a criminal. As the car door closed, sealing them into the quiet sanctuary, Nia finally let out a long, shuddering breath. She looked at Hyun-woo, at the blood on his shirt and the iron resolve in his eyes, and realized the secret was no longer a weight she carried alone. The city would spend months unraveling the corruption Hyun-woo had exposed. They would spend years talking about the night the most dangerous man in Seoul chose a girl over his empire. But as the car moved through the streets, away from the flashing lights and into the dawn, Hyun-woo simply reached over and gripped Nia's hand. The city finally saw the face of its real nightmare, a monster who had finally found something worth saving.